Spots on the sides over here. There's plenty of room, but we are really blessed to have an excellent Synod Attorney, and I can tell you how important that is to have someone who is a faithful member of a congregation, who has a strong spiritual life, who is a woodworker, who is a proud graduate of Iowa State University. Go Clones! Craig Ongley has served us faithfully throughout my term as bishop. He retired and started his own firm, and I think he's probably busier than he was at his firm. But he has been through stuff with us, with congregations that were trying to leave, that were trying to do some things that were not right, and he helped us hold them accountable for their actions when they tried to take property from the synod. This may not sound like the most scintillating title for your Friday afternoon. Fiduciary duty. The Church Council is nonprofit board of directors under Texas law. Now, the reality is it's really important. It's really important as we deal with many of the issues our congregations are dealing with. If you have an aging facility, if you have funds in the bank, if you come to the place where it becomes necessary for a congregation to close, all of these things require us to be stewards of the assets and of the responsibility of our congregations, and that includes the fiduciary piece of that. And so, Craig, thank you. Without further ado, we're glad to have you with us. I forgot to make the joke about the lawyer in the pulpit.
Well, it's only fair then I make a joke about you. You know, you didn't realize this, but when he was a young pastor, he was at his first church, and unfortunately it fell to him to have remedy a problem with the church, and it was the church ended up with a bad leak in the roof. And unfortunately, it was a very small church and a very poor church, and there was not enough money to fix the hole in the roof. So pastor decided that he was going to fix that problem, and he was going to have a very special offering that next Sunday to try to get enough money from the congregation to take care of the problem. So that Sunday arrives, and the time arrives, and he tells the congregation the problem and that he would like to have them give a special donation to take care of the problem. But to kind of juice up the offering, he said, look, anybody who gives the most money will get to choose the next 3 hymns. And so the plates go out, the plates come back, and as he's looking through the plate, he sees a $100 bill. And he says, my goodness, who gave the $100 bill? And the little old lady in the back pew said, it was I, Pastor, it was me. And he said, well, come on up here. So she comes up to the top of the sanctuary, and she says, look, you gave the most money, you can choose the next 3 hymns. What 3 hymns would you like? She says, oh, that's simple. Hymn, hymn, and hymn. Fiduciary duty. Yeah, it's not a great topic from the standpoint that it's something that's kind of, actually, it's a pretty big snoozer. But I will tell you something, as the bishop said, it's extremely important. And one of the reasons why it's important is because many people are not aware that, in fact, they have that fiduciary duty, that they do have certain legal responsibilities and liabilities when you are part of a nonprofit, including a church council, synod council, or any other type of position where you are a director or somebody in authority, even as a volunteer in a nonprofit. Next slide, please. So the old question comes, it says, well, if I have a fiduciary duty, can I get sued? And the answer is yes. It's a very difficult thing to say. It's a very difficult thing to understand that, you know, you're giving your time, you're giving your effort, you're giving many times time and talent, treasure to this organization, and you end up with the potential, albeit relatively small, that you can get sued on a personal basis. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's important for you to indeed understand what your responsibilities are. Now you have to understand, I've been the attorney for the Synod now for about 16 years. And during that time, I have handled a number of problems in a number of different congregations. That's kind of my job. And as a result of that, I can tell you that based upon that experience, I wish I had given this talk 16 years ago. So, first, who are the people that can go ahead and potentially sue an individual who is on a nonprofit board? Well, the first one is the board members itself. Now, I use the term in the slide foundation to also mean a nonprofit. But I wanted you to understand that there are all different types of nonprofits, and as a result, there's one thing that's in common, and they all have the same thing. Each one of the directors, members, whatever, whoever has that responsibility for running that organization has a fiduciary duty. You can be sued by an employee of the organization. You can be sued by third parties such as vendors, funders, nonprofit entities that you might have a relationship with, beneficiaries, people to whom the nonprofit is organized to help, to assist. Does that mean could you be sued by a member of your own congregation? Yep, yes, that's possible. What about people who donate to the church? Yes. Obviously, donations are taken under for a certain purpose, and if that purpose is not done or the donor feels as though that donation was handled improperly, then yes, they have a right to be able to go to the board or to a cause of action to say, I want my money returned, or I want satisfaction that what I gave the money for will happen. Then the last two are probably the most difficult, and that's the state attorney general. A lot of people don't realize that because you're a nonprofit under law, that the attorney general actually has the authority to deal with any nonprofit within the state, whether it's Texas or Louisiana. And as a result of that, on a certain very egregious case, obviously, they do have the authority to step in and deal with the situation. But also you have other government officials who do have an involvement with you as far as a council member and a nonprofit. And probably the ones that you are most, realize it would be the Internal Revenue Service, because each one of you is a 501(c)(3). And as a result, there are certain rules and regulations you must follow in order to continue to have that designation, in other words, that tax-free designation from the IRS. But also because you have employees, the Department of Labor is involved, or OSHA, for example, very specifically is involved. So those are the types of people that can interface with a board of directors, a board of members, whatever you want to call it, but the people that are responsible in a nonprofit. So what is a fiduciary duty? Fiduciary duty originates from a term, actually a Latin term meaning faith or trust. Therefore, really, it's the fiduciary's responsibility as a board of directors. It's a very lawful and ethical obligation of one party to act on the best interest of another party. That's it. Simple. Okay? You are expected to act in the best interest of whom? Well, you're set up as a nonprofit for a purpose. So that is your responsibility, okay, is to be set up and to do whatever is in the best interest for those individuals. Obviously, as far as you are as church council or synod council is concerned, it's your congregation, the people who are members in that congregation. One of the things that you have to understand is based upon the idea that with the fiduciary duty, you're holding yourself out. You've got the responsibility to basically have an ethical standard that's beyond normal, that's beyond the normal ethical standards we have as human beings with each other. And as a result of that, you have to be aware of that heightened responsibility and what your job is in order that you carry out that responsibility. Next slide, please. One of the things that probably gets more boards into trouble and more directors into trouble than anything else is obviously finances. And can be other resources, but most often that's what happens. And this is where many times the problem arises, where the body that is part of the nonprofit has certain thoughts about what the goals, aspirations of that organization are or should be, and unfortunately the board of directors has a view that is different, and consequently a conflict results. When that conflict results, then obviously that is a point of contention. And the difficulty with that is, and the reason why that occurs, is because there's not a clear expression within that organization of what the goals and responsibilities of that organization truly are. So each of you as a congregation, you look at that mission statement, because that's the guiding force, if you will, for your congregation. And you, if you are a member of that church council, that is the base of your fiduciary duty to the people in that congregation you serve. Next slide, please. You may ask, well, why is this important? And that's a good question. Why is it important? Well, one thing is that as part of that duty that you have responsibilities to things within that organization, not only the people, but also the assets of that organization, the things that it holds, the things that it owns, the money that it has. One, you have to produce, for example, you have to protect assets, you have to protect the organization's finances, basically from a misuse of power. Somebody doing something in a position that they have that misuses that position and does something with the assets of the organization that is contrary to the needs of that organization. One of probably the best examples of that is stealing money. Another thing is that also people that are directors within a nonprofit have to understand is that part of your job is to be able to prevent conflicts of interest that arise within an organization. You might say, well, what kind of conflicts of interest might there be? And it is a good question. But I will tell you that they arise a lot, and here's the way they arise. You have a member of your congregation who is an insurance agent. And as that insurance agent wants to insure your church. The problem is that insurance agent is also a member of the church council. Now you have a conflict of interest. So that situation, as you can well imagine, especially in smaller congregations and smaller towns, arises pretty frequently. So that doesn't mean that it can't happen. That means if it does happen, you have certain responsibilities to make sure that as you go through doing the choice, for example, how we choose who's going to get the insurance, that you do it in such a way that you deal with that conflict of interest. So the rest of the board has that responsibility to see that that conflict of interest is resolved. The other responsibility that you have is obviously communication, and that means greater transparency between you and the people that you serve. Again, you also have that higher level of performance, a higher level of professionalism, if you will, that you need to have or do as part of your job as a council member. So realize that you're going to be held to a higher standard, so you better understand what that standard is. And that's what I'm going to try and tell you about. Next slide, please. Go to the next one. Yep. All right, there are basically a number of different things that a person has as a fiduciary duty that flows to you as a director, as a council member. And to me, there are basically two broad categories, and we're going to talk about those because those situations that I just talked about are discussed or are dealt with in those two areas. One is the duty of loyalty. The other one is duty of care. Under the duty of loyalty, you have a nonprofit's interest. In other words, the person on that council, the person that holds that responsibility, must treat the interests of the organization as paramount. In other words, over their own. Secondly, they must handle, as we talked about earlier, the proper handling of conflicts of interest. The other thing is they have to exercise good faith. And I think that's the thing that probably is one of the problems that people have is that, well, what is good faith? Well, how do you define good faith? And I will tell you, it's a difficult thing to define. Everybody talks about it, but how do you define it? Well, I always find the easier thing is to basically say, well, good faith is that you treat people better than you treat yourself. And that's the simple way to put it. And you approach every problem, every issue that you have in the council with that thought in mind. And if you do that, I guarantee you, you'll not run afoul of a problem being a fiduciary in your organization. Again, your business interests, whatever you have, are subordinate to those of the interest of the organization. Secondly, the big thing is, again, a lot of times you have problems with is disclosure. And how does that disclosure happen? Again, remember we talked about here just a minute ago, the conflicts of interest, okay? That's the disclosure. Hey, we have this situation. We have this person who we need to hire an attorney for the church for a problem that we have. We want to sell our outlot, and we need an attorney to help us handle the sale of that property. Well, the church president's daughter happens to be the lawyer in town over there, and she will be more than happy to handle that problem for you. That is a conflict of interest. That is a problem. How do you deal with it? Well, as a council member, that is your responsibility to deal with that situation. Now, does that mean that she cannot handle that legal issue? What do you think? She can, as long as two things happen. One, it's fully disclosed that the conflict exists. Secondly, if it's her dad that happens to be the member of the council that is present at that time, that person must recuse themselves from the consideration of the time that the council is discussing who they're going to hire as a lawyer. And he recuses himself, and then the council, the rest of the remainders of the council, make that decision. And as a result of that, you've now handled the conflict of interest. And if the best decision is to hire this person's daughter, then that's the best decision. Okay? But it's the process that you go through in order to be able to handle the obvious problem or the optics that might come up, because you might have another member of the church who is an attorney, and they find out that this person's daughter is now been selected to do this work for the church. And that attorney says, how come I wasn't chosen? Sounds like a problem that can happen, doesn't it? Same thing with the insurance agent. Happens a lot. The next thing is honesty and integrity. Obviously, that seems to be obvious, but it really is important. You have to have a great deal of honesty in the way you approach every issue, everything that you do as a member of the church council. That is your fiduciary duty. And one of those things is, and again, this is one of the things that get people into trouble more than I see, more often than not, and that is confidentiality. Which, it's kind of like Las Vegas. What happens in council stays in council. Right? And I can't emphasize that enough, because what ends up happening is if you start... Sorry. Usually I talk loud enough that I don't need one. But if you end up with a problem like that, this is a very, very difficult thing, because it causes derision and problems within the congregation itself. And as a result, you end up generating conflicts that could possibly be avoided and should have been avoided if confidentiality was held. Why? Because a person who maybe gets a piece of that information only gets part of the story and reacts to that part of the story, and then they talk to someone else who talks to someone else who talks to someone else, and now you have a full-blown congregation in crisis. Okay? And I hate to say it, but as human beings, we do that to each other. And everybody wants to be a little bit more superior than everybody else, so consequently, I want to say that I know more than you know, and therefore I am better than you are. And therefore, I'm going to pass on this rumor to you because I got it first. Aren't I great? Well, I'm fortunate that happens. So how do you cut it off? You don't start the thing in the first place. Council, everything that happens there is confidential. What will be released to the congregation, announced to the congregation, will be announced by the president or the pastor, whatever may happen concerning the issue. But that's what will happen. And that's the way the information, and the only way the information should get to the members of the congregation. That way, everybody talks with what? One voice. Duty of care. Obviously, part of that is that you have to be diligent in performing the function that you have, okay? And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, simply, if you're given stuff to read, you read it, okay? If the budget goes out, you ask questions about the budget. You look at the budget. You deal with the budget. You take a look at the budget in a very granular sense. And you say, is this the best budget we have, given what we anticipate as revenue, and what? That serves the mission of our church. What did I say earlier? What is your fiduciary duty? Is to forward the mission of that congregation. So that's the question, again, you have to ask with each action. And that is what you have to ask with regards to the budget, with regards to the money. Okay? What does that mean? You make informed decisions. You don't make staff decisions. You don't make decisions based upon emotion. You make decisions based upon being informed. What does that mean? Yeah, you do the reading. You do the asking. You talk to the people. You get the information. You pass on the information. What are you doing? You're doing your job. And you would be surprised how many people like to be members of church councils just to be members of the church council. And they could care less about what they have to do or what you are asking them to do, and they just show up. Those are the people that are the most dangerous, okay? And if you have a person in your church council like that, then you need to deal with that issue, because that is where your conflict is going to happen, and that is the person who is most likely to break the confidences of that congregation. I'm sorry, again, we're human beings, and that happens. Okay? And then part of your fiduciary responsibility is to take care of that problem. The last one I always talk to about is audits. One of the things that's very important for congregations is that they should have an annual audit. And that annual audit should be done by an independent auditing firm. The problem, and the very practical problem that some churches have, is they're small and they can't afford it. I understand that. And that's definitely a problem. But for those churches who can afford it, they have the kind of responsibility to do it, so that in fact there is a report that goes back to the church council, that says these things are being done properly, these things are being properly accounted for, or these changes we think you need to make in your balance statement based upon these things, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then of course you go ahead and implement them. But that's the idea. So what do you do if you're a small church and you can't form an audit? What do you do? Well, you might have somebody in your congregation who is an auditor, who's an accountant, who feels capable with regards to finances, and that they can audit it for you, for their church. But again, what are they when they do it? They become a fiduciary. Yeah. Because they have a duty to do whatever is in best interest of that congregation, and is including with the way they look at the books and the way they do the auditing. So that's the way you have to deal with that. Go ahead to the next slide, please. One of the most difficult times we have, and I want to talk about probably the last one on this page. Again, we talked about directors having to act in good faith. And we have to act reasonable and to be appropriate in the circumstances. But again, there are special hazards, there are special things that should all of a sudden cause some type of a bell to go off, and you say, wait a minute, I've got to really look at this situation. This is not normal. This is not usual. And part of that, too, is what happens if you are a lawyer and you are on that board? And what happens if you are an accountant and you are on that board or on that council? Well, some of the times you have to basically separate yourself from your profession in order to be able to act in that council in the appropriate way. And the reason is sometimes because our professions get in the way. And you have to be smart enough and realize that that happens and to deal with it. And you, as a fiduciary, that is your responsibility because nobody's going to do it except you. So if you have that, if you are a professional within your congregation, whether it's being any licensed individual, it could be an architect, it could be a lawyer, it could be a doctor, it doesn't matter. If you are a professional, you have, in a sense, a heightened responsibility to that council that's even over and above what you might call the fiduciary duty to that council. Next slide, please. Again, one of the important things is that what does a board do, or what does a council do? Basically, they have a decision-making function, but the most important function they have is not only the decision-making portion, but they have an oversight function. And what is that oversight function? Who do they have oversight over? Anybody want to ask? How about the pastor? How about church secretary, church treasurer? What about the person who runs Sunday school? Who takes on that task, kind of becomes the superintendent, if you will, for the church congregation and runs Sunday school. As the church council, as the fiduciary to that, you have oversight over those individuals who have those jobs within your congregation. And I'll bet almost all of you didn't realize that. But that is part of that fiduciary duty. I think the last thing is very important, is that while you are trying to do this duty, while you're trying to do the best job you possibly can as a council member, and you're trying to do that oversight function, there's one thing that you have to remember always, always, always. And that is, don't be obnoxious. Be kind, okay? You know, you're just there, make sure things are going okay, have a chat, sit down, have a cup of coffee, whatever, but that is what you want to do. But you do it in a way that's unobtrusive, but at the same time, you are getting the information necessary to do your job. Next slide, please. Probably one of the things that many times happens in a church council, and I have to be very honest about that because I've seen it happen, and that is sometimes pastors who are members of that church council, whether because they are a member vis-a-vis their church constitution or they are an ex officio member, they obviously have a great deal of sway with regards to what happens in that congregation. The problem is that sometimes there are pastors, people in authority, who may, how do I want to put this? They like their way, okay? And as a result of that, you as a church council all of a sudden sit there and you're in a pickle. Because here's your pastor who's saying, I think, or we should do this. And we should do it this way, right? And you just sit there and go, what times do you think is most reaction people have? Okay, Pastor, that's the way we'll do it. Okay? that's the problem. Again, this is one of the things I wanted to bring to you, because that's what you can't do. You have to take a look at whatever that problem is, whatever that issue is. You have to bring it up. You have to do the work to study it, get the information on it, whatever that issue happens to be, and you have the responsibility to discuss it within that group, in that church council, and to come to the decision, because why? It's the council's decisions and not the pastor. But also, again, we understand, and I understand, there's a practical matter that happens, okay? I can tell you to do that, and you can say, yep, that's what I should do. And then the next time that happens, guess what happens? Okay? So what I'm telling you is, and what I'm trying to inform you of, is to try and avoid those situations. And sometimes it takes, believe it or not, a conversation to happen between the church council and the pastor to clear the air, to be aware and to understand and to have a dialogue between them as to what their responsibilities are and who should be doing what. And once that decision is made, then obviously at least people know what they are doing and how they're supposed to do it. But if you're a member of that church council, you cannot disavow, I guess, your responsibility. You can't, what's the old thing? Because I was ordered to do it, right? No. You can't abdicate your responsibility to say, well, that was the pastor's decision. It's yours. Next slide, please. One of the things is that as a church council member or synod council member, sometimes you need information. And remember, I told you, you have to study the issue. There are issues that come up where expertise is required. Consequently, there may be professionals that you're going to interface with, whether it be lawyer, accountants, or whomever. As a council member, what is your responsibility? And the thing is that the law says is that if you have a professional and you hire a professional or you get a professional's advice, you are reasonably allowed to rely on it. So in a sense, the pastor may not be your excuse, but the professional may be if a later controversy comes up with regard to that decision. You say, yes, we looked at that decision, we got expert advice from our church lawyer, and we made the decision based upon their recommendation. You have now taken care of your fiduciary responsibility. Unless whatever that was proposed was so preposterous that no one in their imagination would ever do it, okay? Obviously, that's very, very unlikely to happen. The problem that you have, again, I want to mention, is that what happens when that issue comes up, and that legal issue, it comes up, and there's a member as an attorney on the board, okay? Now, the attorney says, okay, this is how I would advise you to do that. What do you do? What is that? He's not being paid. He's got his profession. He's got all this training. Should you rely on it? Well, remember what I said, that sometimes as a professional, you have to leave that profession behind when you become a member of that council. And so the council, in a sense, has to leave you behind, too. In other words, yes, that attorney on your council may say, yeah, this is what I would suggest. But if you want to observe that fiduciary duty, if you want to be square with the law, shall we say, and make sure that you are operating within the confines of your responsibility, then you go get the outside lawyer and let them give you the advice. Next slide, please. This often happens, especially in larger churches, that many times there are committees that are made as part of the congregation. You may have a fellowship committee, you may have a, different types of worship committee, you may have a stewardship committee, you may have a long-range planning committee, a lot of those different kinds of committees. And sometimes churches have very active committees as part of their structure. Sometimes they don't, but many, many do. As a responsibility of that, as a member of the church council, what is your responsibility with regards to those committees? What did we talk about earlier? Remember I told you about don't be obnoxious? Same thing. Committees have a job to perform. They have a task that they are told to perform. We do fellowship, or let's do a 5-year future plan for the church. Where are we going to be in 5 years? Where are we going to be in 10 years? They have that call, if you will, to be able to do that task or those tasks. But you have, again, what did we talk about earlier? Oversight, right? You have the oversight for those committees to make sure, one, that they are doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, and secondly, that in fact they're doing the job. I mean, that they're actually doing it and that they're performing that function. Because the worst thing in the world is to delegate responsibility and then have that responsibility not taken care of. Next slide, please. I think I mentioned it earlier, but this slide kind of goes back to it. A director or person on the council may not rely on individual group's opinion if the director knows information that makes reliance unwarranted. In other words, if you know that it's not correct, if you know that that person or that result is based upon faulty information. It is your responsibility then to bring up and say, well, I understand what you're saying, and I know that that's the result you think it should be, and I know that you want to make this decision in this way, but I think you're wrong, and I think you're wrong because why? The facts that you have, I believe, are incorrect. Let me show you. Now you're doing your job. Next slide, please. As we talked about earlier, good faith in a manner that director reasonably believes to be in the best interests of the organization. Like I said, how to treat other people better than yourself. The thing that gets people into trouble more often than not, again, other than stealing money, is directors not putting themselves ahead of what the congregation, in other words, doing what they believe they should be doing and not what they believe the congregation should be doing, okay? And as a result of that, this causes, again, a conflict, and this is what can, in many instances, cause a rift within a congregation and a congregation to split apart. So if you do your fiduciary duty, you should be able to head that off. You should be able to deal with that as a member of that church council and be able to keep that from happening. Again, you are the people that are the ones that have that responsibility to make sure that the congregation operates the way it's supposed to. And what? Forwards its mission. I want to keep coming back to that all the time. And if you don't have a mission statement, get one. Obedience. Remember I talked about that also a little bit earlier, but I want to heighten that again. You, as a member of the church council, never want to do anything that is contrary to that mission statement for the congregation. I can't put it any simpler than that. Why? Because what happens when you do that? You're putting your interest ahead of what? The interests of the congregation, and that is a violation of that fiduciary duty, correct? Okay. Believe it or not, sometimes this happens, and it happens in corporate life too. Basically, my background, the stuff that I do for the Synod, I do as a pro bono thing. I'm basically a corporate and international trade lawyer. I speak tariff, by the way. So as a result of that, my normal day job is totally different than what I do for the Synod. And so sometimes in a corporate sense, there are times when an opportunity may arise. And that opportunity is a question of who that opportunity belongs to. For example, Let's say the church is perhaps interested in buying another piece of property to do something that the church wants to do, okay? Maybe expand in some way or set up a satellite office for the church or whatever, buy some more land for a parking lot, okay? Who knows? But what happens is that the person becomes aware that they can get that land cheap, okay? And so what happens is before the church can act, they go out and purchase the land. But they only became aware of that because of their position on the church council. That is a big no-no, and that's what we call basically usurping an opportunity. And that is a big, big, big problem with fiduciary responsibility. And that one will definitely buy you a lawsuit. So don't do it. Most of the time this doesn't happen in smaller churches, but sometimes, for example, in larger churches, because their contracts that they give out are worth a significant amount of money, many times the vendors who are the people that will contract with for whatever those services happen to be, whether it's insurance or Cisco as far as the food that you may have for your kitchen that you offer, or furniture that you have for your church preschool, or again, Lord knows all the different ideas. I'm sure each of you can think of them on your own. But that person that you're dealing with, the salesperson, wants to give you a gift. They want to give you a look. We're so glad that you're thinking about our insurance company. We have this thing next weekend in Austin, and it's a golfing weekend, and we'd love to have you there. Whoops. What happens if the insurance person says, well, we're very happy for your business. Here's a koozie. Okay? Or here's a bunch of pens. It says Lutheran Brotherhood on it. Okay? Okay. Again, it's the manner of the gift and the value of the gift. And then what is the responsibility or what is intended as a result of that gift? Is it truly a giveaway? Or is there truly something being asked in return for that gift? And the closer you get to that question is that, yes, they're expecting that if I give you this weekend, you're going to say yes, and we're going to get the insurance job. Then, obviously, you've not only crossed the line, you've jumped over it. Okay? All right? But, again, if, Lutheran Brotherhood comes in and wants to give you pens or, whatever happens, that's not unreasonable. Okay? So make sure that when you're at church and you need that koozie, you got it. Next slide, please. Let's talk about that next one. Yeah. Disclosure. I think we talked about it a little bit earlier with regards to conflicts, conflict of interest. But there's other types of disclosure too, and I think, again, we need to mention that just briefly. And that is when you have anything that you are part of the group, especially part of the council, and you have any information that's germane to what is being discussed, then you have the obligation to forward that information, to disclose that information to the others in the council. You should not withhold that information, obviously, because then a decision may occur based upon wrong facts, wrong situations, and so forth, especially when you had information. And a lot of times the reason why you withhold that information is because it's detrimental to you. If it's detrimental to you, I'm sorry, you disclose it. Okay? Again, that is your responsibility. Now, if you're a member of the congregation, you don't have that duty. You don't have that responsibility. But as a member of the council, you do. Next slide, please.
we've talked about this one, and that's the conflict of interest. I think we've beat that horse to death. So let's go to the next one. One of the things that I think is often done in many organizations, and I wanted to talk about a little bit about as far as, again, the conflicts of interest, because, again, this is one of the biggest issues that happens when you're part of a board. And I also serve on a number of boards, and one of the boards that I serve on is a very large board, and it's the Circle 10 Boy Scout Council. And I've been a member of that board for a number of years, and we deal with a very significant amount of money every year because it's a very large council. And so our opportunity for conflicts of interest to arise is pretty substantial. Okay? I think that a lot of people don't realize that one of the best ways to combat and to deal with conflict of interest and to make sure that that does not occur in your organization is to have a conflict of interest policy. And it's basically a policy that just basically says to each council member, here is what your responsibility is, here's what a conflict of interest is, and if you've got a conflict of interest with this church right now, or with this council, we need to know it right now. And if you sign down this bottom line, you are saying that you do not have a conflict of interest, and we as a council can do what? Rely on it. Every year for Boy Scout Council, I have to sign that conflict of interest. And which is kind of interesting because I do for the Boy Scout Council what I do for the Synod. I also donate my time to the Boy Scout Council as their general counsel as well. So again, there is a possibility if the council, if the Boy Scout Council wanted to hire my law firm, for example, to do work, or my law firm came to it and I find out that it's made a proposal to the Boy Scouts to make a thing, or to the Synod, for example, to do some work for it. I've got a disclosure problem, okay? So, again, it's not unreasonable for a church to have a conflict of interest policy. And if you feel as though you need one, let the bishop know, and I will supply you one. Again, it's my job. So I will give you one. You can use it in your church, and away you go, okay? Next slide, please. Policy. So I think one of the things that probably ends up most often is when there is a conflict of interest, not only is it when it's not necessarily taken care of, it's a conflict of interest, what I call the submarine one, and that one's it's a conflict of interest and nobody knows it, except obviously the person involved does, but they don't know it, and it happens and it's there for years, and then all of a sudden something happens and that problem comes to light. But the difficulty is this thing has happened for 5 years, 10 years. So how do you deal with that? What is the problem? Well, if there is a lawsuit as a result of that because something was mishandled and somebody believes that they have been harmed in some way, so they file a lawsuit because of that, that's when you become liable. So that's why, again, that disclosure is very, very important in requiring that disclosure. Okay, so in this last hour, I've managed to scare the devil out of you. Next slide, please. I want to remind you of this. Whom shall I send? Send me. That's your job as the church council, and you shouldn't shirk away from it. You should grab a hold of it, relish it, but remember you have a responsibility to the people that you deal with and you work with and who are members of your congregation to do the job and to do it effectively. Thank you very much.
Yep. Well, thank you, Craig. And, that's what lawyers do is they scare you. But it is important, and, you deal with different realities in every context. But I think these are just good reminders of our duties as leaders and good reminders that this is serious stuff. When you say you're going to be on a church council, you need to take this seriously. If you're in the Synod Council, we take it seriously. and we need to be wise. And again, if something you heard today, if you're curious, you can contact our office. We can get you in touch with Craig for things like conflict of interest policies, those kinds of things. Professional audits, man, are expensive. The Synod knows that very well. But you got to have some kind of auditing going on, all right? I mean, it's really important. Jeannie Hagan reminded me that this was Craig's PLMA project. So Craig will be one of the PLMs that graduates tomorrow, and this was his project to present to you all for this. So there's another reason that we love the PLM. Okay, so a couple housekeeping things. Reminder again about getting headshots if you're a rostered leader. If you're on Synod Council, the Dollars would love to see you and get a headshot of you.